Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs. I'm the programs manager here at the library, and today we are setting sail, crossing the channel, heading on over to England to learn about a very famous, very important, and perhaps entirely non-existent figure. We'll see. It is such a pleasure tonight to be joined by Elizabeth Winkler as she speaks about her brilliant book, Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. A couple of notes about this conversation. Elizabeth will be giving us a presentation about the research that she put into this work and the main arguments that she explores across it. After the presentation, we will briefly discuss what we have learned, and then for the last 15 minutes, we are going to open this up to questions from our audience. So we'll start with our in-person audience, and if we have time, we'll move to our online audience who's inside that camera right there. Hello, online audience. Thank you for joining us. So if you have questions, start thinking about them now and feel free to put them in the chat if you're on Zoom. And finally, copies of this wonderful, truly delightful, incredibly amusing, and quite controversial book will be for sale after this event. So if you want to know what everyone is fighting about, I encourage you to purchase your own copy. On to our remarkable speaker tonight. Elizabeth Winkler is a journalist and critic whose work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the New Republic, the Times Literary Supplement, and The Economist, among other publications. She received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University and her master's in English literature from Stanford University, and she lives in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Winkler to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. What a lovely introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've heard that France is very happy to be heretical about the English, so I think we're going to have a good discussion tonight. As Emily said, I'm going to give a little overview of the authorship question before we jump into discussion. So, the life of Shakespeare is a famously difficult one to construct. Biographers have described him as a jigsaw puzzle for which most of the pieces are missing, a man-shaped hole, and the literary equivalent of an electron, forever there and not there. This has led many of our greatest writers and thinkers to suspect that the name was a pseudonym for a concealed author. Literary history is, of course, full of writers who concealed their authorship, and the Renaissance was a particularly great age of assumed names. Henry James wrote, "I'm sort of haunted by the conviction that the Divine William was the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." Walt Whitman agreed. We all know how much mythos there is in the Shakespeare question. Whitman, the poet of democracy, was no snob, but he was convinced that there was another mind behind the plays. So was Mark Twain, who said all of Shakespeare's history, as furnished by the biographers, is built up course upon course of guesses, inferences, theories, conjectures, an Eiffel Tower of artificialities rising sky high. Whitman suspected, actually, that there was a wolfish earl behind the plays. Helen Keller agreed Shakespeare of Stratford is not to be even thought of as a possible author of the most wonderful plays in the world. How long must we wait for the solution to the greatest problem in literature? Vladimir Nabokov wrote a poem about the subject. You easily, regretlessly relinquish the laurels, concealing for all time your monstrous genius beneath a mask. Reveal yourself, god of iambic thunder. The question has also interested a lot of lawyers and judges, who, of course, are experts in the evaluation of evidence. It may actually be one of the few subjects that has united Supreme Court justices from across the ideological spectrum. They agree, as Stevens put it here, that the evidence he was not the author is beyond a reasonable doubt. Sandra Day O'Connor, too, thought it was someone other than our Stratford man. But the authorship question remains the most vexed, unspeakable subject in the history of English literature. Even the phrase Shakespeare authorship question often elicits contempt, eye-rolling, name-calling, mudslinging. If you raise it casually in a social setting, someone might chastise you as though you've uttered a deeply offensive profanity. Someone else might get up and leave the room. Tears may be shed, a whip may be produced, you will be punished, because it is heresy to suggest that the God of English literature might be a false god. I've come to think of the authorship question as a kind of metaphor for the problem of history, of how we know what we think we know about the past. And it's also a metaphor for the problem of authority. Who has the authority to determine the truth about the past? In England in 1964, the question actually came before the courts, and the presiding judge, the Honorable Richard Wilberforce of Her Majesty's High Court, summed up the problem this way. The evidence in favor of Shakespeare's authorship is quantitatively slight. There are a number of difficulties in the way of the traditional ascription, a number of known facts which are difficult to reconcile with Shakespeare's authorship. So here are a few of those difficulties he was referring to. William Shakespeare, as his name was originally spelled, born in 1564, has no recorded education. He may have attended his local grammar school, which taught Latin grammar and arithmetic, but the works published under the name Shakespeare are, of course, dazzling in their erudition, steeped in the learning of Renaissance humanism, knowledge of philosophy, classics, history, politics, the law, French, Italian, Greek drama, music, theology, medicine, astronomy, and on and on. Shakespeare's knowledge of classics and philosophy has always puzzled his biographers, admitted the scholar E.K. Chambers. A few years at the Stratford Grammar School do not explain it. In the 19th century, scholars began noticing that there's an extraordinary knowledge of the law in the plays. Shakespeare shows the most complete mastery of the technical phrases, the jargon of the law. No dramatist of the time used legal phrases with Shakespeare's readiness and exactness, but he had no legal education. How do you explain this? There's a huge amount of scholarship on his knowledge of Italy, of Italian cities and culture, customs, the Italian language. Several of the plays draw on sources, Italian sources, that hadn't yet been translated into English. Where did this author develop such deep knowledge of Italy and Italian? Same goes for French and France. The play Love's Labour's Lost, we don't often see it performed today, but it's set at the French court of Navarre with figures who are based on historical French figures. The scholar J. Dover Wilson actually confessed his bafflement about this particular play, saying to credit it to a butcher boy who left school at 13 requires one to either believe in miracles or to disbelieve in the man from Stratford. So what do we actually know about him? He married, had children, became a successful businessman, a shareholder in a theater company, an actor, a property investor. Records show that he dodged taxes, was fined for hoarding grain during a shortage, pursued petty lawsuits. He didn't bother to educate his daughters. They couldn't write. One signed with a mark, and this sort of funny squiggle you see in the middle is the mark of Judith Shakespeare, which is, of course, you left a mark if you couldn't sign your name. Another signed with a painfully formed signature, described by the director of the British Museum as probably the most she was capable of doing with a pen. So this is very strange. How could any writer, let alone the greatest writer in the English language, be indifferent to the literacy of his children? And it's especially odd in Shakespeare's case because the women of the plays are so intelligent. They're witty, they're erudite, they're shown writing sonnets, composing letters, reading Ovid. In The Tempest, Prospero is so proud of the fact that he has educated Miranda, but Shakespeare's daughters were not literate. When he died, he left detailed instructions for the distribution of his assets, but mentioned no poems, plays, manuscripts, books of any kind. At his death, only half of the plays had been published. Why didn't he say anything about his poems, 154 sonnets? His will bore no trace of literary interests, let alone a literary life. And why isn't there any connection between the works and his life? The relationship between an artist's biography and his writing is always a difficult subject, concedes the historian Blair Warden, but there can be no other important writer since the invention of printing for whom we are unable to demonstrate any relationship at all. At his death in 1616, the literary world was silent. This was an age of effusive eulogies when there were often tributes to other writers in poems, in letters. When the poet Edmund Spenser died, for instance, you can find a letter saying, "Our poet Edmund Spenser died last Saturday and was buried at Westminster." When the playwright Francis Beaumont died just 7 weeks before Shakespeare, he was honored for his service to the nation with a burial among the poets at Westminster Abbey. But when Shakespeare died, silence. By contrast, other writers of the period did leave lots of records testifying to their careers as writers. They left education records, letters referring to their writing, payment records in which they were paid for writing, diaries, journal entries, manuscripts, and usually some kind of notice at death that they spent their lives as writers. The absence when it comes to Shakespeare is incredibly irritating to scholars. As you can see here, Professor Stanley Wells told Newsweek a few years ago that he would love to find a contemporary document that said Shakespeare was the dramatist of Stratford-upon-Avon. That would shut the buggers up. The only samples of his handwriting are these 6 signatures, all spelled differently. It has caused such distress in Britain that in 1985, Her Majesty's Stationery Office published an official report on the matter. It is obvious at a glance that these signatures, with the exception of the last 2 on the will, are not the signatures of the same man, wrote the Jane Cox, the keeper of records at the National Archives. Almost every letter is formed in a different way in each. Literate men in the 16th and 17th centuries developed personalized signatures, and it's unthinkable that Shakespeare did not. You can see by contrast the signatures of other Elizabethan writers, and they look quite different from Shakespeare's. So the marked discrepancies between them led her to conclude that some of them may have been written by scribes or by clerks who drew up the documents on which they appeared. In an era of widespread illiteracy, proxy signatures by scribes were legal. This was an age in which 3/4 of women and 4/5 of men couldn't write their names. So the marked discrepancies between the signatures lend credence to the views of the most extreme anti-Stratfordians, she said. Could this man write his own name, let alone anything else? Some scholars quietly admit doubts. Yes, of course, Shakespeare could have been a pen name or a scam or a committee of Bacon, Marlowe, Oxford, one professor wrote to me. He was perfectly fine with letting Shakespeare be seen as the author, even if he knew it might not be true. I think we've got a big enough task in figuring out what the plays are doing in themselves, he explained, although I wondered if knowing more about their author wouldn't help with that. Shakespeare is a mystery that scholars cannot explain. Often they appeal to the miracle of his genius. Samuel Schoenbaum, one of the 20th century's leading scholars, resolved the mystery by explaining that Shakespeare was superhuman, an explanation that is, of course, no explanation at all. What did this Superman look like? This is the classic image of Shakespeare from the title page of the plays. You may have seen it before. It is a famously awful portrait. Critics over the years have complained that the head is huge, much too big for the body. The skull is of horrible hydrocephalus development, the mouth too small, the ear malformed, the hair lopsided like a bad wig, the countenance is pudding-faced, one eye is lower than the other, light hits it from several directions at once. I never saw a stupider face, said the artist Thomas Gainsborough. The figure has no neck, so its head appears to be floating on top of the ruff. Something very funny is going on with the outfit. The shoulders are grotesquely large and vilely drawn, wrote another critic. In 1911, an anonymous tailor writing in The Gentleman's Tailor pointed out that the figure has 2 left arms. The doublet is so strangely illustrated that the right-hand side of the forepart is obviously the left-hand side of the back part, and so gives a harlequin appearance. This, the tailor noted, is not unnatural to assume was intentional and done with express object and purpose. The scholar Northrop Frye put it bluntly, the portrait makes Shakespeare look like an idiot. Now, the suspicion has arisen that the portrait's deformities were, as the anonymous tailor suggested, intentional, that it is a kind of joke portrait depicting a clown or a fool as the author. 2 left arms signal left-handed writing, which in ancient tradition was associated with deception. Writing with the left hand is to make some secret circumvention, to deceive or defame. There were lots of reasons in the Renaissance. Oh, here's a portrait, just for contrast, of on the cover of Sir Walter Raleigh's works, and you can see he looks much more dignified and proportional, and he has all sorts of emblems around him communicating information about his identity, his coat of arms, and so forth. So Shakespeare's portrait is actually quite strange looking by comparison. Lots of reasons in the Renaissance to use a pseudonym. These are a few known Renaissance pseudonyms. Women used them, obviously. If you wanted to have some freedom of speech, Democritus claimed he was using this name in order to have a little liberty of speech to criticize the government or the church. Satirists crafted humorous, hyphenated pseudonyms like Simon Smelnave and Tom Teltroth. And in 1597, a Puritan moralist named Joseph Hall complained about a crafty cuttlefish, he said, who was hiding in a black cloud of ink and shifting his fame onto another's name. And Hall went on to describe this poet's works in terms that specifically matched Shakespeare's early poems. But probing the mystery is effectively forbidden. In 2011, Professor Wells, one of Britain's leading Shakespeare authorities, declared that it is immoral to question history and to take credit away from William of Stratford. I love that quote, immoral to question history, when inquiry is the very basis of the historical discipline. So this is what I set out to investigate. There's a mystery around how these works were created, and that's intriguing in itself, but the taboo makes it even more worthy of investigation. How has a belief in miracles been sustained into the 21st century, and why is there such resistance to questioning it? What I found was that in the West generally, and in Britain in particular, Shakespeare functions as a secular god. Pilgrims began flocking to Stratford in the 18th century to pay homage to the poet. They dropped to their knees at the birthplace, the purported site of his nativity. They cut relics from the local mulberry tree like pieces of the true cross. They sang odes to Shakespeare, untouched and sacred be thy shrine, Avonian Willie, bard divine. And this extreme veneration, bardolatry, intensified in the 19th century, an era of expansive imperialism, when Shakespeare was held up as a national icon, proof of Britain's cultural superiority. By the mid-19th century, English departments began to develop, and ideas about Shakespeare that were enshrined during this period of extreme veneration have been passed down from one generation of scholars to the next. This may be why the authorship question has taken on the emotional, fanatical veneer of a religious war. No one takes kindly to the denial of his God. This is one of my favorite paintings of the baby Shakespeare in a kind of nativity scene as a Christ child, done in 1970. I think he looks a little bit vapid, but it's a remarkable painting for the barefaced equation of the Renaissance poet with the Son of God. So this book is partly a work of literary history, the history of this strange centuries-long feud for the truth about the God of English literature, and it's also a work of journalism in which I interview the various scholars and heretics involved in the debate, who offer their own theories about the identity of Shakespeare. Was it Francis Bacon, the Elizabethan philosopher and statesman whose knowledge of law, philosophy, foreign languages seemed to match the knowledge in the works? In 1603, Bacon wrote a mysterious letter to a lawyer who was writing to meet the new king, James I, and he signed off with this wish, so desiring you to be good to concealed poets. So who was the concealed poet? Was it Christopher Marlowe, a playwright and government agent who disappeared in 1593, reportedly murdered just weeks before Shakespeare emerged? What about Edward de Vere, the eccentric 17th Earl of Oxford, probably the favorite candidate today, who traveled through the areas of Italy with which Shakespeare seems most familiar, and who was rumored to be writing covertly? A theory of group authorship has arisen to account for the vast knowledge in the plays. And is it possible that a woman was involved? Many readers over the years have felt something weirdly female about Shakespeare. In 1664, the philosopher Margaret Cavendish wrote, "One would think he has been metamorphosed from a man to a woman to create these female characters." Orson Welles observed that Shakespeare was clearly tremendously feminine. The Cambridge scholar Juliet Dusenberry says Shakespeare's drama deserves the name feminist, for in his plays the struggle is for women to be human in a world that declares them only female. But how did this 16th century male playwright come to write feminist drama? Two women have been proposed. Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, in 1931. She was a kind of a Renaissance Gertrude Stein, had a literary salon and encouraged and supported lots of writers in the period and did her own work as well. And more recently, Amelia Bassano, who has various Italian connections and was connected to the company that performed the plays. So the authorship question is, I like to describe it as a kind of massive game of Clue played out over the centuries. The weapon is a pen. The crime is the composition of the greatest works of literature in the English language. The suspects are numerous. The game is played in backrooms and basements beyond the purview of the authorities. Now and then reports of the game surface in the press and the authorities, by which I mean the scholars, are incensed. They come in blowing their whistles and stomping their feet, waving their batons wildly. They denounce the game in the strongest terms, attacking not only the legitimacy of the question, but also the sanity of those pursuing it. Shrieking that there is no game to be played, the authorities overturn the board and send the pieces flying. Their protest is too much. It is so excessive, so disproportionate to its object, that it only confirms for the players the worthiness of their pursuit. And when the authorities finally retreat, red-faced and sweaty, exhausted by too much baton waving, the players quietly set the board straight and continue playing, fortified by their oppression like some persecuted religious sect. The game is its own reward, the pursuit of truth and intrinsic virtue. One can get postmodern about the truth. One can argue that the author is merely the creation of various cultural discourses, that texts are continuously remade by the actors that perform them and the readers that consume them. But one cannot get around the fact that some person or persons set those words down on paper. Who done it?
I want to talk about a lot of things. I want to talk about the deification of Shakespeare. I want to talk about the idea that he's this sort of bleeding wound for these scholars, that it really hurts when you poke it. But first, I want to return to what we've just learned from this brilliant presentation you've given us. So you're talking about the authorship question, and there are multiple camps in this question. There's the Stratfordians, who believe that William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon was the author. There are the Baconians, the Marlovians, thank you, the Oxfordians. It seems to me like those are the three strongest camps. Can you identify which person you think is the strongest candidate to be Shakespeare, and why? Yeah. And perhaps offer a bit more information about each candidate.
Yeah, I mean, they're all fascinating, and I made a decision in writing the book that I wasn't going to argue for anyone in particular. I felt as a journalist that my proper position was sort of to report on the controversy without advocating for any candidate myself. And the other thing I found doing it is that it's actually, what's so fascinating about this subject is that you can go read about one theory and be really persuaded by it, and then you go learn about another theory and you think, oh wait, maybe it's this one, and it sort of starts to mess with your head a little bit. And the subject really ends up being about how we construct the past, and you can construct different narratives about the past depending on which pieces of evidence you look at and how you arrange them and how you interpret them. Because it's such a historical, such a subjective enterprise, history, ultimately. It's not a science. It's a narrative you construct, and so people will construct different narratives. And even when you have something that's somewhat less controversial than this, historians are constantly revising and rewriting their narratives of the past, and you get conflicting narratives of what happened in, the American South, for instance, or, et cetera. So I wanted the book to sort of be about that larger problem, and I wanted to let the reader grapple with the questions and the gaps and the uncertainty without me telling them what to think. So I won't tell you who I think it was. I'm sorry. I know, it's very disappointing. But we can talk about some of the candidates. Oxford has probably been the favorite for the last century, the Earl of Oxford, since he was proposed in 1920. And I think that's because he was a very, very learned, scholarly person who seems to have all the knowledge that would be necessary to write the works. And he was rumored to be writing plays. In 1589, a critic said, "There's a crew of courtly makers who have written excellently well if their doings could be made public and sort of found out, of which first number is that noble gentleman, Edward Earl of Oxford." So he's saying this man was writing covertly, but we don't have any plays under his name. So to a lot of people, he has that's because the plays of Shakespeare are the plays of Oxford, and there's sort of biographical parallels that, things that happened in his life that turn up in the Shakespeare plays that have made people think, oh, this is a man writing about his life, experiences. But of course, it could be someone else writing about his life too. So that's where the interpretation and the theorizing becomes very tricky.
And with Oxford, there's resistance to that theory, and this will allow us to understand, and then we'll get to the other candidates, but this allows us to understand how tightly people hold on to the image of Shakespeare that they have inherited. People resist the Oxford theory because he was nobility, and we like the idea that Shakespeare was the son of a glovemaker, and he was an everyman.
Yeah, he was an aristocrat. He came from an incredibly sort of old noble lineage, born to huge wealth and privilege, and we don't really like the idea of Shakespeare as a member of the 1%. We love the rags to riches story, the boy who came from nothing and made himself immortal through words. It's a beautiful story in a lot of ways. It's a kind of Cinderella story.
It's perfectly crafted.
Yeah.
It's very easy to consume.
Oh, yeah, and we have a deep emotional attachment to that story, which makes it difficult to examine critically.
So walk us through the other candidates as well. So we have Oxford, the nobility,
Yeah.
perhaps the most compelling case. He has these interesting biographical links to Shakespeare's life. He perhaps allows us to understand the plays more deeply through reading biography into them. And then we have another candidate, which is Bacon. Why might he be Shakespeare, and why might he not be? What's wrong with him?
He was the first one proposed in the 19th century, and he was really revered in that period as a genius. And people thought, well, he was a great genius. As a philosopher, he must also be the genius who wrote the works of Shakespeare. And part of it also had to do with the fact that he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer in the court, and they were discovering how much legal knowledge is in the plays. And this is clearly a person who studied the law. So, Bacon seemed to be a good match. Why is he not the? It's some people would say, well, there's no proof that he could write poetry. That he was really more of a philosophical mind, but he was very interested in drama and seemed to be very interested in sort of what he called the advancement of knowledge through theater. So there's room there to consider his involvement, and he certainly was one of the great intellectuals of the Elizabethan age. Marlowe is a favorite candidate of some people because his work stylistically seems similar to Shakespeare's. A lot of scholars have said Shakespeare was haunted by Marlowe's expression, and then others, the Marlovians will say, well, that's because Marlowe became Shakespeare, that it's all one writer developing and sort of evolving the same style through those two bodies of works. But of course, there's no evidence that Marlowe lived after 1593. So the argument for that, he was a spy. He died in various very mysterious circumstances. Some people think he was assassinated. Others will say, well, he faked his death and went on to write the works of Shakespeare. But if he faked it, he did it successfully.
It's a delicious game to play. It's really so compelling that you could choose a narrative and then adhere yourself to that and just continue down that rabbit hole forever and forever and forever. And it's interesting in the interviews that you conduct in this book, the scholars, the experts with whom you converse, they seem to take two stances. One is to say, it does matter to me knowing that William Shakespeare was William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon because that informs my reading of his texts. Yeah. And then there's a second position, which I personally found a bit more compelling, which I'm hoping you could speak to, which is the position that it doesn't actually matter.
Right.
And perhaps there's even a sort of beauty in the mystery and in the not knowing and in the entertaining multiple possibilities here. Speak to that stance.
Yeah, you do often hear that, we have the plays are what matter, who cares who wrote them? And I think that's understandable in a lot of ways. You certainly don't have to care about the authorship, but when it comes to scholars, I find it a little bit of a cowardly sidestep, because they are scholars of Shakespeare, and it's presumably their job to get the facts right. Otherwise, what are they doing? So I think.
But you don't think they have a right to say, my sole focus is the theater itself, and the biography does not inform
they don't have,
what is on the page?
I just think they have an incomplete view then of the works, right? Because an artist's life does inform their writing, and there's the potential for so much deeper and richer investigation into those works if you understand where they're coming from. Because right now they just kind of come out of a black hole, out of nowhere. And there's a lot that could be illuminated, I think, if you knew more about their creation. And mostly I just think the scholars who just say who cares, it doesn't matter, I think they're kind of being cowardly, honestly. Because you wouldn't say that about any other major historical figure. You wouldn't say who cares. You would not say that. It would be completely pathetic. So I think it's them basically trying to skip around the authorship question, instead of they don't want to address it, so they say it doesn't matter. And the other thing that's become interesting to me, at least if you think of the writing of the plays as a kind of crime, who done it, who did this crime, to some extent, it's not the crime anymore, it's the cover-up, It's the fact that, yes, the question of who wrote the plays is a matter of some historical interest, maybe boring to some people, maybe a bit academic, but the refusal for years upon years of scholars to investigate the subject, they're putting up sort of blinders and pretending that they're just not going to look there. And then they're attacking people who do try to investigate it, has inflamed the question. So now it's actually become a problem not only of who wrote the works, but of the academic integrity of the scholars who claim to be sort of the priests of Shakespeare.
It's interesting, you've been accused, we'll get to the Atlantic article if we have time, but you've been accused of being anti-truth, anti-expert.
Right, yeah.
How do you respond to these criticisms when you hear them?
I think they're projecting their own anti-truth and their own, their projection, really, because it just doesn't make any sense. There's so many writers, scholars, great thinkers over the years who have said, come on, there's obviously a question here. So and those are ad hominem attacks, right? Instead of actually dealing with the evidence, if they think that there's some flaw in this, then they should just address the argument, right? But they don't do that. Instead, they attack you in various ways. And that's obviously a sign of weakness, right? If you have to attack their character that way, yeah.
And I want to push you on one thing, and then we'll go back to nicer topics, but you, not to spoil things, but you conclude the book with a lovely chapter on what you describe as negative capability, the ability to sit with what is unknowable, the fact that there is not an answer to the authorship question, it's just not going to be solved. The historical evidence, it just isn't fully there. There are too many narratives that are too compelling. If that is the case, that we just have to sit with the not knowing, be comfortable with the fact that this is a question that remains open, would you not think that's the same thing as saying, I don't care who Shakespeare was, I just want to enjoy the theater?
Well, what I was trying to say with that, negative capability is a phrase that John Keats coined to talk about the ability to dwell in doubt and uncertainty without reaching for a kind of false certainty. So it doesn't mean don't inquire or don't pursue a question. It means don't assume you have definitive knowledge or absolute certainty when you don't. So it's more about being willing to dwell in a space of doubt and not knowing, which is where you have to start from if you're going to pursue knowledge, right, in the first place. So yeah, to me that's a little bit different from saying sort of who cares or it doesn't matter. I do think there are some people who. One of the people I interview in the book is the great Shakespeare actor Mark Rylance, who talks about his feeling that the author sort of purposely chose to remain unknown in order to create this kind of mask on which people could project all of their own ideas about Shakespeare and their love of the works without fixating on an authorial identity. And so I think there is something very beautiful about that, and there was probably an intention there in terms of the creation of that persona Shakespeare.
And being able to contend with the slipperiness of Shakespeare opens the art to a multiplicity of experiences.
Yeah.
There's a lovely quote from, I believe it's from Rylance's wife in this book, where she says, Shakespeare's works are a house, and you can go in and look at one window or another. Each case provides a different perspective and reveals a different quality in the works. Mm-hmm. So you can look through the Bacon window, or you can look through the Marlowe window, or you can look through the Oxford window, and each one reveals to you a different perspective on the work itself. Has that been your experience as you've returned to the Shakespeare's texts?
It has, actually, because I do think the authorship question, some people say it's a distraction from the plays and the poems. I don't think it is. I think it actually returns you to them in new and surprising ways, and it makes them fresh and rich, and you see things in them that you wouldn't have before. So I actually think it's a fantastic way to revitalize interest in the Renaissance, in Shakespeare, in theater, People complain that the humanities are dying. There's this great subject sitting right here that they could pursue if they wanted to, And
you make the excellent claim as well or you remind us that the authorship is kind of a modern invention, that the author in Renaissance and Elizabethan England didn't exist in the way the post-Enlightenment author existed as someone who stamps their name on a piece of work because they made it and it's theirs and they own it and they're an individual with a sense of self. Yeah. Shakespeare was more diffuse, almost.
Yeah, well, it was an interesting period because they were transitioning out of the manuscript culture of the Middle Ages. You have the invention of the printing press and the possibility of kind of creating this, of creating authorial identity, because in the Middle Ages, manuscripts were often sort of anonymous or just had initials on them. And so that you get a bit of a hangover from that period into the Renaissance, where people are still often printing works anonymously or with just sort of initials or with pseudonyms, or an allonym is the creation of, or the use of someone else's name instead of your name. So they played with identity and authorship a lot. And I think that's something that's sort of foreign to us today. We don't do that in the same way, except occasionally, someone like an Elena Ferrante, you see that playfulness around authorship.
Well, it's the same. We've been asking the same question for hundreds of years, which is, where's the author in the work?
Right.
And we're playing with it differently now. But Shakespeare was also, whoever Shakespeare was playing with it in very similar ways.
Yeah, absolutely. The funny thing that you start to feel when you dive into the question and then return to the plays is how much the plays themselves seem to be playing with authorship, in terms of they're so often about mistaken identity and deceptive appearances and things not being what they seem. The scholar Marjorie Garber, Harvard scholar, has said that the plays thematize and theorize the authorship controversy. So there's a kind of uncanny quality there. Yeah.
I'm rapidly running out of time to interrogate you, and I want to talk about the Atlantic article.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Tell us what you wrote, and tell us what happened afterwards.
So I wrote an article for The Atlantic called "Was Shakespeare a Woman?" And it was meant to sort of look at the female candidates that had been proposed, Mary Sidney and Amelia Bassano. It was edited to focus a bit more on Amelia Bassano because she was the more recent one. But it was basically about this question of how do you account for the extraordinary female characters and the feminism of the plays, and is it possible that a woman was involved in some way? And the reaction to that was just sort of, it was explosive. The article went kind of viral. People loved it or hated it. And then, yes, I was attacked in various corners as a kind of a Shakespeare denier,
I encourage you all to read the responses to this article. It's absolutely incredible, the language. You were equated to people who were saying that climate change isn't real and flat earthers. Degrading the holy value of truth.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was very shocking at the time, and I was a youngish journalist. I had never been attacked like that publicly, very unpleasant experience. And so I just sort of sat with it for a while. But what I realized was that, what was behind those attacks? What are they doing? They were trying to make the authorship question a moral issue, right? Because we think of climate change denial, Holocaust denial, those are ethical problems.
They're dangerous.
They're dangerous. And so, but why is a question about the authorship of 400-year-old plays, which is honestly kind of a boring historical subject, right? Why is it being elevated into an ethical problem? And that's what so those attacks, I'm actually very grateful for them, because they were sort of like red flags telling me to keep digging. And the book was born out of that. And I wanted to understand basically how this subject became immoral, how it became so taboo.
And you make the claim, which is not unfounded, that Shakespeare occupies the status of a deity in our culture. He is an untouchable god.
Yes, that's essentially what happened over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, which was really the growth of the British Empire. Shakespeare was set up as a kind of god figure. So Shakespeare is deeply entwined with nationalism, with empire, with religious feeling. I also think after all the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants after the Reformation, then you have the civil wars in England, there was a need for a kind of unifying figure that brought the nation together. And Shakespeare emerged in that period as that unifying figure, so much so that you see him depicted as a kind of replacement Christ. And in the 1840s, the philosopher Thomas Carlyle said Shakespeare was a rallying sign for all the English-speaking people of the world. He was worried about how are we going to keep the British Empire together. And he said that King Shakespeare, is going to be the rallying sign for Britain. And that's really the function that he has served. Yeah.
And then the authorship question really emerges in vigor in the sort of 19th, 20th century as the myth of England as empire is failing as well, as England is becoming a failing empire. And so he is clung on to all the more viciously as the mythology of Shakespeare is clung on to all the more viciously as these other mythologies are failing at the same time.
It's interesting when the authorship question, I mean, there you can trace sort of murmurings about it earlier, I think, but it becomes really explosive in the mid to late 19th century. And actually what I think the issue was that is when the first full-length Shakespeare biographies were written in the 1840s. They're really quite recent. You know, people had been trying for a long time to research and find enough records to write a biography of their national poet. But they found lots of documents, all of his lawsuits, his hoarding grain, but they couldn't find the evidence of a literary life that you can find for other writers of the period. And so what they did in those biographies is they basically made it up. And you find that they're full of Shakespeare could have, must have, might have, maybe, probably. They're deeply fictional, they're speculative. One of the most famous ones of recent years, Will in the World by the Harvard scholar Stephen Greenblatt, was described in the London Review of Books as biographical fiction. You know, and so they've, since the 1840s, they've continued doing the same thing. They imagine Shakespeare's life because they can't actually explain how he acquired the knowledge and the experiences to write the works. And so I think when those biographies came out in the 19th century, some readers were clever enough to say, oh, what's going on here? This is absurd. This is myth. These are myths that have been written. And I think that's why then they began really, going after the question.
But that's why he's such a potent sort of object or symbol of a nation, because he's so empty. He can be anything. He can be adopted by anyone.
Exactly.
He's the everyman.
He's the perfect, as what one scholar actually said, he's the perfect container for our desire and creative empathy, because you can project whatever you want really onto that. This was actually at a conference 10 years ago in DC at the Folger Shakespeare Library, where it was called Shakespeare, the Problem of Biography, and all the scholars sort of convened to wring their hands about what a big problem this was. And this one scholar, Brian Cummings, he said, the biggest lacuna is the mystery of how Shakespeare ever became a writer in the first place. So it was a fascinating conference that they held, but what I find kind of funny about it, Shakespeare and the Problem of Biography, is that they didn't consider, in this gathering, that the problem of biography could be that they have the wrong biography. That was not up for discussion.
Well, they can't contend with that. You couldn't admit to that being a discussion, because then the problem falls apart entirely. We have to switch to audience questions in a second, but the title of tonight's talk was the Shakespeare industry, and I want to talk a bit more about what that industry looks like. You've written a brilliant article about visiting Stratford-upon-Avon. You also talk in the book about how sort of the comedic quantities of Shakespeare biographies that are produced each year, sort of about this figure that doesn't actually exist. So talk about how Shakespeare, he was a symbol for empire, and then as empire failed, he became the symbol that they clung to even more. And now he's been so intensely commodified in our sort of, to use a trendy word, hyper-capitalist culture. So what does the Shakespeare industry look like, and how do we tear it down?
Well, if you go to Stratford-upon-Avon, which is a little town about 2 hours outside of London, you will find sort of a Shakespeare Disneyland that's been created there. It's a kind of theme park, kind of a drab one, sadly, because it is still England. But
so sorry if you're watching this on Zoom from the UK.
But no, I love many parts of England. Sorry, that was unnecessarily rude of me. But it's a very drab little town. People are sort of shocked when they go to it, that they look around and say, "Wait, this is it." And what they've done there is they've created they have different properties, sites that they have associated with Shakespeare, and the central one is the building they call the Birthplace. Which is this, it was in the 18th, 19th centuries, it was this sort of little ramshackle hut, which an actor named David Garrick strode into, and he went up to the first floor and declared, "This is the birth room, this is where Shakespeare was born." He sort of felt inspired. And ever since then, it has been a site of pilgrimage, and people would go there and sort of weep and throw themselves down, kiss the floor. They had sort of like spooky sleepovers where they would spend the night in the birthplace with Shakespeare to commune with him. You know, so for the Victorians, it was very this heightened emotional experience of trying to reach the spirit of Shakespeare. But it became an English Bethlehem. It's a nativity site. It's a tourist site. You know, you can go to what they call Anne Hathaway's cottage. You know, there's no real evidence that she grew up there, but you can, you know, they have the chair where she supposedly sat, and you know, all these things. There's a whole industry created there, so it's a great tourist industry for Britain. And you know, you can go to the gift shop and buy Shakespeare rubber ducks and Shakespeare tea towels and Shakespeare chocolates and Ophelia silk scarves, and yeah, it's a brand. Shakespeare's become a brand. Yeah.
That's such an interesting analysis of it. I'm about to very relinquishingly hand my microphone over because I already see hands in the audience, but I'd like you to share just one final anecdote with us from the book for those that have not yet had the pleasure of reading it, because I think it's such a perfect example of how deeply funny the Shakespeare drama is. Just the fact that it's all these clearly very brilliant men who've read a lot of theater and are acting in very theatric ways. So can you tell us about the time that they put Shakespeare on trial?
Oh, yeah. You mean with the Supreme Court justices? Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it was 1987, because several Supreme Court justices have become very interested in this topic. They decided they were going to hold a kind of mock trial, and it was set up as Shakespeare versus the Earl of Oxford, you know, who wrote the works.
Who had both been dead for 400 years.
Right. Yeah. No, people really care about this, you know, and. They debated some of the theories and the points of evidence back and forth. And at the time they said, you know, the burden is on the Oxfordians to prove their case, you know. So there was a kind of, it was a little bit slanted, I would say, towards tradition. And as things always are, you know, you really have to. So they sided with Shakespeare, but very hesitatingly. And two of the justices later pursued the subject more. They became very interested in it from the trial and reversed their opinions and decided that actually Oxford was the true author of the works. That was Justice Stevens and Justice Harry Blackman. So yeah, there you have it.
The matter is so important that the Supreme Court has had to weigh in.
They've had to weigh in.
It's living theater. It's fantastic. Elizabeth, thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause, please? We have time for questions. We'll start with in-person, and then we'll go to Zoom if we have time, and Emma will bring you the microphone.
Hello, I'm Thomas Drellner. I'm Oxfordian. I'm a stark Oxfordian. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for your book, because it's the best book about the authorship question since Diana Price 20 years ago. So my question is very, very simple. I don't think you're going to answer, but you present the Earl of Oxford for about 70 pages in your book, and all the others are about 10 pages. Oh. So, dear Elizabeth Winkler, are you an Oxfordian?
Wow, you really counted the pages, huh? I didn't even know that's what the count was. There's got to be more than 10 pages on some of the others, really? Oh, okay. Well, I think I would say that Oxford has been the most popular candidate, right, for the last century, and most people who doubt the authorship are Oxfordian. So I gave him the most space because he's been sort of the main contender. And a lot of the skeptics who I met with were Oxfordians, not all of them, but many of them. And there's probably the most evidence for his case, right? Because so many people have spent time researching it. There's Oxfordian societies in Britain and America. So there's a sort of whole industry behind the Oxfordian theory. I find it very interesting. It's very compelling. I think there's clearly more to, you know, clearly Oxford was doing more than what is documented about him, because we have these rumors about him writing covertly. But, you know, the extent of that and what that really looked like, you know, I think is still a matter of, we need a few more bits of evidence. And I think there's some Oxfordian scholars working on that.
Hi, I'm a non-Oxfordian, obviously American, and so coming into this completely tabula rasa, I'm wondering what it's like for you as a compelling young American to walk in and say Shakespeare didn't write it because he obviously wasn't erudite, he didn't educate his daughters, and he's funny looking. So what's that like for you, confronting this sort of English establishment? I'm just curious about your personal experience.
Yeah, of course, for Brits, having an American come in and tell them anything, they don't like that. So there's a natural sort of holding you at bay for that reason. But there are plenty of Brits themselves who have questioned the authorship over the years, and some very, very, well-esteemed ones. So I think people sometimes want to say, oh, it's just, Americans being rude about England, but the English themselves have questioned this subject. And then you can also find Americans who are very attached to the traditional Shakespeare figure, because actually that rags to riches story, the traditional Stratfordian story, is kind of like the American dream, right? The boy who comes from nothing and becomes famous and wealthy through his work. So there's actually, among a lot of Americans, there's an attachment to that traditional narrative as well. They feel, that Shakespeare's kind of almost an honorary American. I didn't really answer your question, did I?
Going up against establishment.
Yeah.
You're a woman, you're young, and that must be really difficult for you, because are they not going to just sort of frame it as, oh, the young people are blowing up everything, and actually Shakespeare is the history of the English language? So I'm saying it must be very difficult for you to challenge that.
I suppose so. I don't naturally seek out controversy, and I've found some of the blowback to this. Yeah, it has been when your work is misrepresented or you're sort of attacked in ways that feel unfair or dishonest. Yes, that's very unpleasant. But I've learned actually through this just to kind of let it all slide off my back, and they're just making themselves look like fools by doing that in the end, aren't they? So I think they might be helping me.
Hi, thanks for all of this. Is really quite interesting. So I'm curious, and maybe this question comes from a little ignorance, but beyond the man Shakespeare that you do have the documents about, him having the theater company, why him? Why would he be the guy?
That's a great question, yeah. There are different theories about that. I don't know if you remember that one poem I read where it was about someone who was shifting his fame onto another's name. So, people sort of think that because he was involved in the theater as an investor and an actor, that his name was kind of used as, okay, we'll use that name. But it's spelled slightly differently on his birth, his baptismal and burial records in Stratford. It's actually spelled Shakespeare. And then it's tweaked slightly in the plays and poems and appears as Shakespeare. And it's actually quite a suggestive name. We don't see it that way today, but Shake-Spear, especially sometimes it was hyphenated that way, it recalls Pallas Athena, who emerges from the head of Zeus in mythology, shaking her spear, right? And she was sort of the patron of theater, of poets in the Renaissance. Writers would invoke her as their muse. So it's a highly suggestive sort of literary name. And the spear was interchangeable in the Renaissance with the pen. So the image of a writer shaking their spear is sort of a writer shaking their pen. It's in some ways, I want to say it's sort of an obvious pseudonym, but we've become so sort of used to that name we don't see it as such. But I think there's something sort of self-consciously literary and elusive in that name, Shakespeare. Anyway.
First of all, I want to say I'm so excited to read this. I actually attended the Shakespeare Institute in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I was the American anarchist who was asking these kinds of questions, and my professors were basically telling me to be quiet. So I appreciate this. Totally different area with my research, but the one thing that kind of came up over and over when I would ask these types of questions was Hamlet, and twins. And I'm wondering if you're, without any spoilers, if you go into any theories about the Hamlet timeline and the twins.
Yeah. So Hamlet, the play, is based on a 13th century Danish legend that was written in Latin as Vita Amlethi. So it's a very old tale. It's been around for a long time, and there were stage adaptations. It was there was a French version of it that the author seems to have used, and then there were stage versions of it in England in the 1580s. So Hamlet was around. It's kind of an old Scandinavian myth. Most scholars don't think it has anything to do with the boy named Hamnet, and except for the one scholar who put it forward is Stephen Greenblatt in his biography. I think it's kind of an odd connection to make, because Hamlet, the play, is about regime change, political legitimacy, and political violence, in which, a man contemplates suicide and the murder of his uncle before, being killed himself. And so people have suggested, Shakespeare must have been memorializing his dead son, Hamnet, in that figure. What parent would remember their dead 11-year-old as a suicidal young man who's, murderous? It's a very strange, doesn't really make any sense, I don't think. But they've reached for that theory in an attempt to connect the plays to this man's life. I don't think it really holds up. Are you also referring to the novel Hamnet, which I know was very popular?
Just sort of this sort of timeline.
Yeah.
Relationship between
when
his son died and when Hamlet was written.
Yeah, well, Hamnet died, I believe, in 1596, 97. And then what's sort of awkward is that that's actually when a lot of scholars date some of the most cheerful Shakespeare comedies, like As You Like It and Merry Wives of Windsor and Much Ado About Nothing. So it doesn't really look like a man who's in mourning, unless you wait a few years later to this play Hamlet, which I think the argument to try to connect it to a dead boy is kind of reaching. Yeah.
We had some questions on Zoom about the female candidates for Shakespeare. Joanna's asking, she says, Virginia Woolf imagines Shakespeare as having a sister, Judith, who had no ability to publish her work because she is simply a woman. And she wonders about the possibility that she published under her brother's name.
Who won? Sorry, what?
Virginia Woolf imagines Shakespeare as having a sister, Judith, who had no ability to publish her work because she is simply a woman. I wonder if it might be possible that Shakespeare had a sister who published her work under his name.
Well, we have no evidence that anyone in Shakespeare's family could write their names, let alone, write the works of Shakespeare. So I don't think that Shakespeare's literal sister theory is one that would really work. But Virginia Woolf's writing on the subject is super interesting in A Room of One's Own, and I have written about this a bit in the book. There's a kind of hole, a gap in Woolf's theory, which is that, she imagines a woman of the lower classes who, yes, they didn't receive educations, so no, she's right, they couldn't have written the works of Shakespeare, but she doesn't really factor in that women of the upper classes were highly educated and literate and, often spoke multiple languages and were translating into multiple languages. So there's a hole there, I think, which is that she's not considering the fact that upper class women would have had the education and possibly, the means to contribute to these works. Yeah.
This is probably a rhetorical question. I presume we do not have any manuscripts that in Shakespeare's handwriting. Is that correct? There's no handwriting left of what Shakespeare produced.
No, we have those 6 signatures, which they're not sure that they're his. No, we don't have any of the original manuscripts of the plays in the first folio. Those don't exist. People have tried to look for them and haven't found them. There is one manuscript of a play called the play of Sir Thomas. It's Sir Thomas More, which is anonymous. And it's not included in the first folio, but it has several different hands that were, in a bit of manuscript from that play. And some people have tried to argue that one part of it is Shakespeare contributing to the play, but you can't really, because you don't have an actual sample of Shakespeare's handwriting in the first place, because the signatures are all different and possibly not even his, you can't match his handwriting to anything. So some scholars have tried to argue that, but it's not even the Folger Shakespeare Library admits that you can't. There's no sample to compare it with. So no, we have no handwriting.
We have time for one final question.
It's always been said that a team of monkeys eventually would produce Shakespeare. I think team is the key word here. It doesn't seem to be we need to replace this figure, this myth, with the real guy like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, but a team. And I'm also thinking of AI, which today is doing better and better at mimicking a style. And I do think that maybe at that time when there weren't so many competitors, somebody might have come up with this recipe, how to write a Shakespearean play. And then there were just different people who applied it, and they wrote these plays. And why not have consultants? Yes, you need legal advice, bring it in. You need somebody who's been to this town in Italy, you can find him. You need a friend. Why are we even looking for a single person? In these times, you had atelier. The painters always had 30 people working for them.
It's absolutely true.
Why would the writer be on his own?
It's true that Elizabethan playwriting was highly collaborative. The theater, is a collaborative space. So scholars are increasingly moving towards a sort of group authorship theory. A volume put out in 2016 called The New Oxford Shakespeare identifies 11 other hands in the plays. So they are saying that, this person that you see on the first folio, didn't work alone, that there's much more behind these works than what we have, traditionally thought. So they're essentially having an authorship debate, even though they don't want to say they're having an authorship debate. There's a bit of cognitive dissonance there, because they're not actually getting rid of Shakespeare, but it is a kind of opening up of the subject. And of course, even among the heretics, lots of people think there may have been, multiple hands in the plays. Some people have described it as a kind of artist studio where you have maybe a Titian who has apprentices and, different people contributing in different areas. Or another model could be people who come in later and revise the plays or prepare. A lot of the plays appear to have been edited for the first folio. The folio versions are different often from the earlier quarto versions. So someone who has come in and revised and edited and updated and altered these works. So there are many different places along the stages of their composition and creation when you could have different hands intervening. Yeah.
Can we have a final round of applause for Miss Elizabeth Winkler? Please purchase this book. Its copies are available for sale. It's so delightful. I cannot recommend it enough. It's truly just the funniest story of lots of people coming up with crazy ideas. And if you enjoyed this event, and in particular, if you were hoping to hear even more about perhaps the theory that Shakespeare could be a woman, you can come to our event next Tuesday with Joanna Biggs and Lauren Euler, where they'll be talking about Joanna's book, A Room of One's Own, A Life of One's Own. She's speaking about different female artists who took sort of crisis periods in their lives as moments of artistic output. So please join us for that event as well. It will be beautiful and lovely, and I hope you have a very peaceful, somewhat sunny summer evening. Purchase the books, and see you soon. Good night.